Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. We're delighted to welcome you to this debate on a very relevant subject today, one which we read about almost every week in our newspapers. Today, the subject of creation and evolution. And we're delighted to have with us two very capable gentlemen to discuss and debate this issue with us tonight, and a very well-qualified moderator as well. Speaking in favor of the subject of evolution, we have Dr. Fischer from the University of Miami. Dr. Fischer received his doctorate from the University of Florida in conjunction with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and is a professor of geochemistry at the University of Miami. He has authored 3 books and more than 100 articles on various scientific subjects. Speaking in favor of the subject of creation is Dr. Henry Morris, who received his PhD from the University of Minnesota. For 13 years, he was head of the Department of Civil Engineering at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, and is now president of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California. He is the author of some 33 volumes and numerous scientific articles. Our moderator today also comes to us from California. Dr. John Warwick Montgomery holds doctorates from the University of Chicago and from Strasbourg University. He is a member of the bar in Virginia, the state of Virginia, and of California, and also is presently the head of the Simon Greenleaf School of Law. It's a great pleasure to welcome these gentlemen here tonight for this debate. Won't you express your appreciation for their coming? Before I turn the debate over to Dr. Montgomery, I would just like to say one word. All of these people are our guests today, and wherever you're coming from, whatever your views, I trust that they will be expressed in a gentlemanly-like and ladylike fashion, and that you will respect all of these people who have come. And nothing less than that would be expected or tolerated this evening. Thank you.
It's my task to ensure that the program this evening is conducted in precisely the manner just described. Having been involved in debates myself, it's going to be exceedingly difficult for me to keep my mouth shut this evening, and therefore my opportunity to say things to you comes at this point, and I want to make some general comments about the nature of this debate and what our expectations are. I noticed that I had something in common with both of the debaters. In the case of Dr. David Fischer, apparently we both spent some time at Cornell. That was my undergraduate alma mater, and Dr. Fischer has taught at Cornell. I don't know if this meant that he spent any time learning the second verse of Far Above Cayuga's Waters. We considered ourselves to have evolved by the fact that we were at Cornell. I don't know if he felt the same himself. In the case of Dr. Morris, we are both members of Phi Beta Kappa. You know, the definition of a super salesman is a person who can sell a double-breasted suit to a Phi Beta Kappa. Debates on the subject of evolution and creation have been looked at with a jaundiced eye. At the time of the Scopes evolution trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, H.L. Mencken said that Brian and Darrow might as well have been two orang-utans shouting up a drain pipe in darkest Africa. But as a matter of fact, debate is a proven scholarly tool for getting at the truth. At the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther and John Eck debated in Leipzig, and many consider that to have been the decisive event in the origins of the Protestant Reformation. In European universities, even today, there is public oral defense of theses, and these defenses take on the character of academic debate. At the School of Law of which I'm dean, we have carried on this practice, and we find that it's a very, very useful device for sharpening issues. But of course, for a debate to achieve such ends, certain conditions must be present. To use lawyers' language, the debate must be in good shape in terms of its substance and also in terms of its procedure. Let me give you an example of the kind of substance that none of us likes to see in a debate that touches in any way on religious issues. This comes from the Canadian humorist Stephen Leacock's book, Sunshine Sketches in a Little Town. Mallory Tompkins was a young man with long legs and check trousers who worked on the Mariposa Times-Herald. That was what gave him his literary taste. He used to read Ibsen and that other Dutch author, Bumstone, isn't it? And you can judge that he was a mighty intellectual fellow. He was so intellectual that he was, as he himself admitted, a complete agnostic, spelled E-G-G-N-O-S-T-I-C. He and Pupkin used to have the most tremendous arguments about creation and evolution, and how if you study at a school of applied science, you learn that there's no hell beyond the present life. Mallory Tompkins used to prove absolutely that the miracles were only electricity, and Pupkin used to admit that it was an awfully good argument, but claimed that he had heard it awfully well answered in a sermon, though unfortunately he had forgotten how. Tompkins used to show that the flood was contrary to geology, and Pupkin would acknowledge that the point was an excellent one, but that he had read a book, the title of which he should have written down, which explained geology away altogether. Mallory Tompkins generally got the best of the merely logical side of the arguments, but Pupkin, who was a tremendous Christian, was much stronger in the things he had forgotten. In that little exchange, the nincompoopishness of the unbeliever is only exceeded by the idiocy of the believer, and in debates of that kind, very little is accomplished. In order for a debate on a subject of the kind we're dealing with tonight to have positive effect, it seems to me, at least two things need to be present. First of all, the debaters must not engage in ad hominem argumentation. That is, they must not speak to the man, they must not speak to their opponent, they must speak instead ad argumentum, they must speak to the argument. What they need to do is to concentrate on the issues, not concentrate on personalities. Thus, as moderator of this debate, I will not put up with any nonsense that consists of personal attack. I can't imagine that the two people on this program would engage in this, but it has happened before. I hate to mention this, but an article appeared in the Miami Herald, Sunday, January the 17th, written by a professor at the University of Miami, and in this article the statement is made that there is a deep abyss of ignorance over which the edifice of creationism has been erected, and also that the creationist position consists of cries in the dark from the lunatic fringe. Now, I would hope that tonight we would concentrate on the issues, the facts on which a debate like this should depend. Then, I beg pardon?
Did you notice the author of the article?
Yes, I believe I did. It's someone by the name of Dr. David E. Fischer. Yes. I have the full bibliographical citation here, as a matter of fact. On the other side, there's a tendency for people to consider anyone who opposes creationism to be some kind of an atheist, some kind of an anti-religionist type, and to slash away at the position of the individual on that ground. We certainly don't want to have this. In a valuable book done back in the 50s by Oxford-trained chemist Anthony Standen, a work entitled Science is a Sacred Cow, pointing out the extremes of scientific self-worship, this statement is made: the question at issue with the theory of evolution is whether God gave things a sort of evolutionary shove every now and then, or perhaps all the time, or whether he just wound things up in the beginning and then let them rip. God is involved in either case. Thus, we can hardly put a person who argues against the creationist position in the unfortunate and perhaps socially deleterious position of an atheist. We don't want ad hominem. What we want is to have the issues dealt with. Then we want to be very careful, it seems to me, to distinguish between scientific fact and personal opinion. Standen describes the extent to which any scientist is believed no matter what he says. And I'm speaking, of course, to both of our protagonists. They are scientists. Said Standen back in the 50s, when a white-robed scientist, momentarily looking away from his microscope or his cyclotron, makes some pronouncement for the general public, he may not be understood, but at least he is certain to be believed. No one ever doubts what is said by a scientist. Statesmen, industrialists, ministers of religion, civic leaders, philosophers, all are questioned and criticized, but scientists never. Scientists are exalted beings who stand at the very topmost pinnacle of popular prestige, for they have the monopoly of the formula, "It has been scientifically proved," which appears to rule out all possibility of disagreement. Thus the world is divided into scientists who practice the art of infallibility and non-scientists, sometimes contemptuously called laymen, who are taken in by it. This was written by a scientist himself, and it seems to me it points out how easy it is to accept scientific opinion without considering what basis the scientific opinion rests upon. We want to be very careful tonight that we don't fall into that error. Again, to use a legal term, we want to be careful tonight that we are not conclusionary. That means we want to be careful that we don't simply state conclusions or opinions, but that we set forth the evidence on which those conclusions are based. Then procedurally, the debate has to be of the right sort, and we're going to be very careful here to limit the protagonists to the time designated. Each protagonist will have 1 hour for his initial presentation. Then after this, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. These must be questions, they must not be preachments, autobiographical sketches, or general opinions on the nature of the universe. And once a question is posed, the person to whom it is posed, it should be to one or the other of the speakers, will have 3 minutes in which to speak to it, and then the other speaker will have 3 minutes to comment upon his answer. Thus, time has a very important part to play in what we do this evening. And you will notice that I have here a device which will make it possible to determine whether people have exceeded their time. If an individual manages to finish before his allotted time, he will of course receive a prize. What is that prize? It is of course the Nobel Prize. I turn the podium over to our first speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Dr. Kennedy also. I appreciate, too, the presence of Dr. Fischer here for this evening, and to all of you also. I would express my appreciation for your interest in coming. After all of these cautions and warnings, however, I don't know whether I dare to say a word. But we'll try. Well, the debate subject, if I could announce it, I don't think it has been formally set forth. It'd be something to this effect: resolve that creation is a better scientific model for the explanation of the origin of the universe and of life and of man than is the evolution model, and I will speak to the affirmative, Dr. Fischer to the negative. And of course, this is a tremendously big subject. When we're dealing with the subject of origins, it really involves everything that there is. It's a worldview, and so tremendously broad in scope, and we have to limit it to some degree. And so let me point out just a few points that we will not try to address, at least I will not try to address. This is not an argument, for example, or a debate between science and religion. Both evolution and creation have very important religious and sociological and philosophical implications and inferences, and that could well be the subject of a debate, but that is not the subject of this debate. We're dealing with the scientific aspects of the issue of origins. Then even that needs to be limited because there are many relevant issues. For example, the subject of the date of creation is important and should be discussed in its proper perspective and context, but we're not concerned, at least in the public schools and the state universities and so forth, with the date of creation as we are with the fact of creation. And so whether the earth is old or young is irrelevant to the subject of whether or not the explanation of things is creation or evolution. And the same thing is true with respect to the history of the world, whether it should be interpreted in terms of catastrophism or uniformitarianism, flood geology or uniformitarian geology. That also is a very important, and it's a related subject, but it's not the issue. The issue is creation or evolution. Is the universe capable of being explained in terms of natural processes, ongoing processes continuing today in a closed universe without supernatural intrusions, or is it not? This is the issue, creation or evolution. And we creationists, of course, maintain that the tremendous complexity and infinite beauty and structure of the universe can only be explained ultimately in terms of the basic creation of the universe, the origin of the universe, of its laws, of its basic systems, by external, preternatural, if you will, processes or forces. The universe is not sufficient to explain itself. So that basically is the issue that I'd like to address tonight, and even though I've restricted the scope somewhat, it still is an exceedingly broad and very important subject, because it does relate to the origin and therefore the meaning of all things, and indirectly to the destiny and the goal of all things. And so it's a very important subject. And although for a long time the creationist perspective, the creationist model, if you will, has been more or less eliminated from public education, we're seeing a significant revival of creationism taking place today. There's an upsurge of interest, and I think the very fact of such a debate as this tonight, and the interest of an audience such as this tonight, is indicative of that. And as a matter of fact, there are today thousands of scientists who have become creationists. Many of them, most of them, like myself, were one-time evolutionists. I was an evolutionist all through college and for some time afterwards, have become a creationist. Thousands of others have. So there's a real return, if you will, to belief in creation as the ultimate explanation of the universe. The general populace, that's true as well. Matter of fact, a Gallup poll just a couple of years ago found that at least 50% of the population, even after decades of indoctrination in the evolutionary point of view with respect to the origin of man, still believe in Adam and Eve as the first man and woman, therefore in creation. And just recently, when an Associated Press poll asked the question, do you believe that creation should be taught in the schools, or only evolution, as is the present case, 86% of the general population, according to the Associated Press and NBC News, said that creation should be taught. 76% said it should be taught along with evolution. 10% said only creation should be taught. 6% said only evolution. And 6%, I think, undecided. But you see, there is significant concern and interest, not only on the part of the scientists, but the general population on this issue. And it is not going to go away. And therefore, I think it's well that you've come to try to find the facts concerning the evidence that's pro and con, so that you can, to some degree at least, make up your own mind, make your own choice. Now, we do need to define the terms, of course. Creation and evolution could be misunderstood in terms of general terms. Different people have different definitions for them. And I would like to think of them in terms of models. That is, you might use the term system or paradigm or concept or something like that. A model is a pretty good term, and we would define the evolution model perhaps in different ways, but let me define it in terms of the definition of Sir Julian Huxley, who was certainly one of the leading evolutionists of our generation. Now I'd like to have the first slide, if I could, please. Sir Julian died a few years ago, but in one of his books, he defined evolution this way. Evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge, he says, forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. And you note the key terms there in the definition. It's a directional process, not simply back and forth, but it goes in a certain direction. It's irreversible, and furthermore, the direction in which it goes is towards higher levels of organization and variety. And the general concept, of course, is that the universe is essentially infinitely old, but perhaps maybe 15 to 20 billion years ago or something of the sort, it was in a chaotic state. The Big Bang took place. It has been evolving, galaxies, planets, and so forth. And on this particular planet, about 4.5 billion years ago, the first primordial molecules began to acquire the ability to reproduce themselves, maybe as recently as 3 billion years ago. And then the first simple forms of life began to evolve into more complex forms of life, finally into human life, several million years ago perhaps. And so there's been a tremendous increase in organization over the ages, according to the evolutionary model. And that process is still going on because there is no concept of an external supernatural agent involved. As Sir Julian says, the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. So the universe is transforming itself by its own properties and processes into these higher levels of organization and greater degrees of variety. Now the creationist says no, that will not suffice to explain the universe. So we would define the model, the creation model, as opposite to the evolution model. This is the evolution model sort of graphically, qualitatively expressed, the horizontal scale being time, the vertical scale being order or organization, or perhaps complexity would be a better term, information, various ways in which you might express this. But the concept is, as time goes on, the degree of organization, complexity, information increases from particles to people. Or as my associate, who isn't here tonight, but if he were here, he would say, from fish to gish. A tremendous increase in organization and complexity over the ages. Creation model, however, is exactly opposite. Creation model envisions the creator external to the universe, transcendent to the universe, and we're not saying who that creator is. We're not trying to describe him. We're not pinpointing this to the Bible or anything of the sort. But the creator is capable and therefore and is wise. He's omniscient, omnipotent, and is able to do what ought to be done, and so he makes things the way they ought to be to begin with. And so there's a creation in which the basic systems of the universe are called into existence in perfect order for their own purpose right from the beginning. And if there have been any vertical changes since, now both models, of course, allow for horizontal changes back and forth. Microevolution, you might call it, or variation. But in terms of vertical change, the evolution model requires an upward change. The creation model suggests a downward change. And since these are equal and opposite in that sense, they do lend themselves nicely to comparative evaluation in terms of their ability to correlate the data that we can see and maybe even the data that we can predict before we see them. Now, in the ultimate sense, of course, it will never be possible to prove either of these in the complete, fully laboratory-proved sense of the scientific method, because we cannot set the universe up into our laboratory and experiment on it to see whether it evolved or was created. The way you can do that, if evolution is true, it operates very slowly, and we cannot observe the evolution of the universe taking place, the evolution of life, the evolution of man, and so forth. That's a matter of history rather than laboratory science. And if creation is true, then the creator is not going to come down in our laboratory and create something so that we can measure it and see if it works. So in the last analysis, one cannot confirm or falsify in the ultimate scientific sense either model, and therefore neither is science in the fullest sense. But nevertheless, each is science in the sense of being able to explain and correlate and predict observable scientific data. And we creationists, of course, maintain that the creation model does a better job of that. Now, you should understand that evolution is not science. I'm not saying that evolutionists are not scientists, because, of course, most scientists are evolutionists, and many very great scientists are evolutionists, but evolution as a concept, as a paradigm, is not science. And unfortunately, many people have said that it is. It's a proved fact of science, but it isn't and cannot be proved. Now let me just document this, and I'm going to be documenting much of what I say from evolutionist writers, and lest anyone misunderstand and suggest I'm quoting out of context, let me say right from the beginning that I'm only quoting from men, I believe they're all men, maybe some women, who do not agree with my position as a creationist. They're all evolutionists, but I simply want you to see what they say, and there are some evolutionists at least who recognize that evolution is not science. For example, in the foreword to The Origin of Species, Darwin's great book, the 1971 edition. Now, every once in a while it comes out in a new edition. Of course, I understand that Darwin doesn't revise his book anymore, but every once in a while a new edition comes out with a new foreword, and the 1971 foreword was written by Dr. L. Harrison Matthews, great biologist in England, fellow of the Royal Society, and he said this. Says, the fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Note this, belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither, up to the present, is capable of proof. And then he says this, the theory is accepted by most biologists as though it were a proven fact. Although their conviction rests on circumstantial evidence, it forms a satisfactory faith on which to base our interpretation of nature. Evolution is a faith. And then, from the point of view of a physicist, a fine physicist, Dr. H.S. Lipson in Physics Bulletin, 1980, article entitled A Physicist Looks at Evolution, says, in fact, evolution has become, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it. Many are prepared to bend their observations to fit in with it. To my mind, however, the theory does not stand up at all. And he goes on to say he thinks we have to accept creation, even though he himself says that that is anathema to him. He doesn't want to believe in creation, but he says the facts point to it. So he says evolution has become a religion. Dr. Paul Ehrlich, one of our leading evolutionary ecologists, and Dr. L.C. Birch at Stanford in Nature magazine several years ago, said this, our theory of evolution has become one which cannot be refuted by any possible observations. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. And at first somebody might think, well, that makes it a very good theory if everything fits it. No, that's what makes it a bad theory. In other words, it's so completely flexible that no matter what you see, you can bend it to make it fit evolution. Same thing is true of creation, by the way. Neither one is capable of ultimate scientific proof. Dr. Ehrlich goes on to say, it is therefore outside of empirical science. No one can think of ways in which to test it. Ideas either without basis or based on a few laboratory experiments carried out in extremely simplified systems have attained currency far beyond their validity. They have become part of an evolutionary dogma accepted by most of us as part of our training. And then Dr. Pierre Grasset, leading French zoologist, Dr. Dobzhansky, one of the leading evolutionists of our country until he died just a few years ago, said Dr. Grasset was the most distinguished of all French zoologists, says his knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. He's an evolutionist, but listen to what he says. In his book, Evolution of Living Organisms, published 1977, he says, today our duty is to destroy the myth of evolution, considered as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon, which keeps rapidly unfolding before us. Now, he believes in evolution, but he says to think that we see it and can explain it is something that's wrong, and we need to destroy that idea. And then one last statement from Dr. Colin Patterson, who is the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, editor of the journal there, and also author of the book Evolution, lifelong evolutionist, one of the leading evolutionists of the world. In a recent address before the American Museum of Natural History on evolution and creation, it was an invited speech to the scientists there, he said, I'm speaking on two subjects, evolution and creation, and I believe it's true to say that I know nothing whatever about either of them. Now, can you tell me, he says, anything you know about evolution, any one thing that you know to be true? He said, I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History. The only answer I got was silence. And then goes on then a little further and says, after spending all of his life in studying evolution, he says, then I woke up and realized that all my life I've been duped into taking evolutionism as revealed truth in some way. And then he says this, I feel that the hypothesis of common ancestry in systematics has not been merely boring, not just a lack of knowledge. I think it has been positively anti-knowledge. Of course, knowledge is the same as science. The word science comes from the Latin word meaning knowledge. Science is knowledge, what we know to be true. And so he is saying evolution is anti-science. Now, let me just review that a bit. Dr. Matthews says evolution is a faith, it's a belief system. Dr. Lipson says it's a religion. Dr. Ehrlich says it's a dogma. Dr. Grosset says a myth. Dr. Patterson says anti-science. Now, I didn't say that. These are not creationists speaking. These are evolutionists speaking, and these are some of the leading evolutionary scientists of the world speaking. But they are honest scientists, and they recognize that this is the situation with evolution. Evolution is a belief system, just as is creation. And the question is, which one does the best job of explaining the facts that we do see and can test, can predict, can observe? We maintain, of course, that the creation model does a better job. Matter of fact, we would say this, that in terms of what we see in terms of the present processes and systems of the world today, and then in terms of the record of the past systems and processes of the world in former times, the evolution model does not predict what we see there at all. The creation model predicts precisely what we see there at all. Creation is a better scientific model. Now, let's look at that for a moment. What about the present systems and processes of the world? What do we expect to see? If you were an evolutionist and you came from outer space somewhere and had no idea what was going to be on the earth, what would you expect to find? If evolution, as Sir Julian has defined it, is the whole of reality, we would, as a first approximation at least, expect to see an evolutionary flux in nature, things changing into other things, and intermediate kinds and so forth, and this ongoing process towards higher levels of organization being observed and measured, and we'd see it before our eyes. And if we did see something like that, of course, for example, if we could see, say, a dog changing into a cat, or a frog turning into a prince, or something like that, if we could really see things like that, of course, we would all be evolutionists. We wouldn't question it a bit, because we would see it. Science is what you see, and this would be observable, and we would see it, and that would be that. But of course, we don't see that. The creationists will say, no, you will never see anything like that, because that isn't the real world. The real world is that the Creator created basic systems, basic laws, basic structures, similar structures for similar functions, different structures for different functions. So in the world there will be an array of similarities and differences, and each particular kind will have its own structure for its own purpose. Some other kind will have another structure for another purpose. There will be a great deal of provision for variation horizontally within the kind to enable systems to adjust to different environments, for example, without becoming extinct and defeating their purpose. But never can one kind be transmuted into another kind. And so the creationist expects to see an array of similarities and differences, horizontal changes within kinds, gaps between kinds. That's exactly what we see. We do not see an evolutionary flux in nature, even at the species level. Now, there may be some species that can be documented as being true species, although the very definition is somewhat arbitrary as to what it is. But let me quote, for example, from Dr. Hampton Carson in the journal Evolution, 1978, Chromosomes and Species Formation. He says this: to a very large extent, the formation of a species is a phenomenon which has occurred in the past, so that the recognition of the events surrounding the actual division of an ancient gene pool cannot be directly observed. In other words, you cannot see a species forming. He says the search for truly incipient species has been difficult and to a considerable degree frustrating. He's one of the leading geneticists. Well, we don't really need to argue that point, because this is so obvious to everybody. We never see this kind of change where one kind of organism changes into something different. We see horizontal changes, and of course it doesn't take millions of years to do that. All the present varieties of dogs, for example, have developed from the same ancestral dog, perhaps 4,000 years ago, probably the wolf. And there are different varieties of cats, and you can see mutations on the fruit fly, and the peppered moth will shift its coloration, and many changes like that. And the different finches on the Galapagos Islands, still finches, but adapting to different local environments and so forth. So we see that kind of change. Doesn't take a long time for that. But never do we see a cat become a dog, or a fruit fly become a mosquito, or anything else like that at all in the present world. And there's a good reason why we don't. And that is that there seems to be a basic principle operating in nature which says it can't happen, as far as we can see, at least, in terms of what we would be able to measure. Now, you see, if the evolution model is correct, and if that does really represent real scientific truth, then there must be some kind of a basic principle in nature functioning to bring things up to higher levels of organization. Some law of innovation and integration, bringing things into being and building them up into higher levels of being. There must be something like that. If it's still going on, we ought to be able to see it. It has been going on if it has produced the present complex level of the organic world, and so if it's still going on, we should be able to see it operating. So there ought to be some fundamental principle of change operating in nature, innovation and integration, call it. Creation says no, there's no such principle as that in nature. Creationists would predict from the creation model two basic principles in nature, a principle of horizontal change within limits, conservation you would call it, because the Creator would create basic systems with a purpose, basic structures for those systems, and so there would be conservation as a basic principle in nature, enabling them to accomplish the purpose. But if there is any vertical change imposed on a system from external environmental situations, for example, forcing a vertical change, the change will not go up because the structure was perfect for the purpose to begin with in the creation model. If there is a vertical change, it's going to go down, so the creation model would predict not a principle of innovation and integration, but conservation and disintegration, exactly opposite. Now, what do we see in the actual real world? Which model does predict the facts? Which is the scientific model, in other words? Well, of course, the creation model predicts precisely what we actually see as the fundamental laws of science, the conservation principle and the decay principle. Conservation principle, conservation of energy, of matter, of momentum, of mass, electric charge, all sorts of conservation principles. Conservation of kind as well, we could speak of, because nobody's ever seen one kind change into a different kind. So there's a fundamental conservation principle functioning, but in addition there's a decay principle that's called by various terms the second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing entropy or of increasing disorder. Some of you use the term law of morpholysis. Various terms that express the idea that things tend to go downhill. If you just let them go naturally, they go down. Now, for example, here's the definition of the second law from Harold Blum of Princeton. He's not a creationist again. He says the second law of thermodynamics has as one of its consequences that all real processes go irreversibly. Any given process in this universe is accompanied by a change in magnitude of a quantity called the entropy. Now, don't let that term scare you. Entropy comes from a couple of Greek words, and those of you that study the New Testament know that it means turning inward, and a system that turns inward on itself goes toward disorder. It has to draw outside information or energy in order to continue functioning, but if it just turns inward, the entropy or the disorder, the confusion increases, and so the entropy measures the randomness or the lack of orderliness of the system. The greater the randomness, the greater the entropy. That's the second law of thermodynamics. The first law is the law of conservation. A conservation of quantity, you might say, a decay of quality, or the basic principles, the basic laws of the universe, because every process, so far as we know in this universe, obeys these two laws of thermodynamics. They're not just laws of engineering. I used to teach them in my engineering classes, but they're also laws of physics and laws of chemistry, and they apply just as well in biology or geology. They're being applied in economics and sociology and various other fields today. These are universal principles. Everything tends to go downhill if you just let it go and do what comes naturally. Now, these two can be expressed graphically this way. The horizontal scale here represents time. The vertical scale represents, say, organization or energy, maybe energy to do useful work or to do work. And the two laws are represented by the horizontal line on the top and the downward sloping line below. The top line is the law of conservation, which says that as time goes on, the energy, the total energy, including matter now, we know that matter and energy are interchangeable in the universe, total matter-energy of the universe is a constant. But the available energy for further useful work in the universe is running down, becoming less available. Now, all we know, of course, is in the historical period when people can actually and have actually measured these entities in terms of all kinds of systems, of course, and always they work. So we show those as solid lines in the historical period, but once you get into the future, beyond the present, or into the past, before the beginning of history, of course, we don't know for sure what they were, so we show those as dashed lines. But at least in science, you proceed from the known to the unknown, and you can extrapolate on a reasonable basis, and so we would assume that trends would continue into the future, and that they were continuing into the past. Eventually, in the future, of course, although the total energy presumably will still stay the same by the conservation principle, the available energy will run down and finally reach zero, maybe a long time off, but eventually it will, because it's heading down to zero. And that will be a time when, well, as the physicists used to call it, some of them still do, the ultimate heat death of the universe, when all of the highly available energy for driving the processes of the universe will have run down and become random motion of molecules everywhere, uniform temperature everywhere, uniform dispersion of heat everywhere, no more gradient of energy so that energy can flow and work can be done. The universe will still be here. The energy will be conserved in the form of low-level heat, but will be dead and not useful. The universe will die. And of course, the important point the important conclusion is that it isn't dead yet. It isn't dead yet. It's a long ways from dead, and that means that it must have had a beginning. Because if it did not have a beginning, if the universe were infinitely old, it would already be dead. It's going to die in time, and it isn't dead, therefore it had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, then the universe, not only energy had a beginning and matter, but the universe of space and time had a beginning, because our universe is a continuum of space and mass, energy, and time, and you can't have any one without the other, so that the universe was created somehow back at some time in the past. And what about that? Well, how can we approach that? Now, the first law says that the universe could not create itself, because in the present structure of nature, no creation is taking place. That's the very first law of science. Conservation, not creation, is taking place today. So the universe could not create itself by its own properties and processes. Sir Julian, to the contrary notwithstanding, the universe is not sufficient unto itself to create itself, but it must have been created by the second law, or else it would already be dead. So the universe must have been created by the second law, but it could not create itself by the first law. So how do we resolve that? Only one way, scientifically anyway, and that is that the universe must have been created by a transcendent creator external to the universe, capable of creating a universe. Now, there are ways of escaping that philosophically, but that is the scientific implication, and of course these principles are exactly predicted from the creation model. So don't anyone say that the creation model is not scientific. It predicts the most basic scientific principles in the universe. Now, someone would say, well, you're misusing the laws of thermodynamics there. Don't point to a creator. Well, let me just make one reference here to one of the most widely used textbooks on thermodynamics, 2-volume set by Dr. Gordon Van Wylen and Sontag. Dr. Van Wylen was Dean of Engineering at the University of Michigan. He's now president of another college. And in their book, they say this: these writers see the laws of thermodynamics as the prior and continuing work of a creator who holds the destiny of man and the universe in his hands. And that's the way I see them too. These point back to the necessary truth of a creator capable of bringing into existence this complex universe. Well, as far as the universe is concerned, that may be acceptable to some evolutionists, that the universe itself may have been created. After all, it's really hard to explain the origin of the universe any other way. To try to do it in terms of the steady state theory, for example, which says that way out in space somewhere, energy or matter is coming into existence out of nothing to balance the decay principle of the second law, or by the Big Bang theory, which says way back in time the energy and the matter came into existence some way to get away from the second law. In one case, you go way out in non-observable space to get away from the second law. The other case, way back in non-observable time to get away from the second law. But in observable space and time, these are the implications. This is science, the other is metaphysical speculation. And these point to creation. Now, the idea that the Big Bang, for example, some 18 billion years ago, or whenever it was, primeval explosion could somehow be the source of all the tremendous order of the complex universe is completely contradicted by the second law of thermodynamics. Here you have a primeval explosion with energy and matter being exploded radially out into the universe, and the universe expanding ever since, supposedly. But how can, by the principle of conservation of angular momentum, for example, a universe which initially is moving just radially all of a sudden produce orbiting galaxies and so forth? Or how can a universe which starts in the ultimate of disorder, and what is an explosion but disorder, and here we have the ultimate explosion, the ultimate disorder, how can you have any more disorder than that? And yet how then can that produce the order of the universe? The order has to go down from then on. So you see you have a serious problem. In fact, Dr. Paul Davies, the astronomer in England, speaks of the miracle of the Big Bang. You have to have a miracle to make it work. And that means you have to do away with the laws of thermodynamics. Well, many people would accept that, but then they would say, well, yes, maybe that may be true, but on the scale of the Earth, in geologic time, say for 4.6 billion years of history, there's enough energy coming from the sun to sustain the evolutionary process, and even though things do tend to go downhill, you can make them go uphill if you do certain things to them, and if you have available energy to them. After all, they will say, the laws of thermodynamics only apply to closed systems, and the Earth is not a closed system. The Earth is an open system, open to the energy of the sun, and tremendous energy is continually bathing the Earth from the sun, and all of the Earth's processes are driven by the sun, including biological processes. And so even though the sun will burn out someday and the process will stop, at least as long as the sun burns, why, there's enough energy coming in to sustain evolution, and so there's no problem as far as the Earth is concerned and evolution on the Earth. But there is a problem. You see, the second law of thermodynamics says that in every system there's a tendency to go downhill. It doesn't say in every system goes downhill, but every system has a tendency to go downhill towards less availability of energy, towards disordering of the structure, towards confusion of the information. It goes down, unless you do something to make it go up or to keep it at the same level. Now, sometimes people will say, you creationists don't understand the second law because you forget that it applies only to closed systems. And if any of you have been under that impression, let me stress again the fact that I'm now talking about open systems. And the Earth is an open system. And it is open to the energy of the sun, and there is enough energy coming in from the sun to sustain evolution over geological time. That's a necessary condition, and that's satisfied, but that is not a sufficient condition to increase the order and the organization and the complexity of the biosphere. Speaking mathematically, you have to have conditions that are not only necessary but sufficient. That's necessary, but it sure isn't sufficient. Now that maybe can be indicated by this sketch. Here I've shown a closed system, and you can think of this as the Earth if you wish, or any kind of a system. That's a closed system. I've got these hard boundaries there. Nothing can get in, nothing can get out, and nobody would argue that in a closed system, the order of the system will tend to decrease. It will decrease, or maybe under some conditions stay the same, but it certainly won't increase, so that I've shown that by the hexagons at time 1 that have become all broken up at time 2. So the entropy of that system has increased. It's a closed system, and so it will do that. Now, what happens when you open that system? Some would say all you have to do is open it up and let the flow of the heat of the sun come in, and then evolution takes care of itself. Oh, no, it doesn't. Now, if you know the equations for entropy in a heat flow situation, as you have an influx of heat into an open system, the change of entropy in the system into which the heat is flowing is equal to the summation of the influx of heat with respect to the absolute temperature per unit. You can write it integral of Q over T and sum that up as the change in entropy. And you see you have an increase of heat into the system, and that increases the entropy of the system. Delta S, the entropy, equal the integral of dQ over T, the influx of heat. So you increase the heat in the system, you increase the entropy, which means you increase the disorder. In other words, that open system will more rapidly go to disorder than if it were a closed system. Just opening it up to heat will not do any good. It won't help the situation, it will aggravate the situation. And it will go downhill more rapidly than it would if you kept it closed, if that's all you have. In other words, something like this will happen. The sun's energy will come in, it'll stir up the atmosphere, great tornadoes might be developed, tear things to pieces, and storms and so forth, and things will just break down. And back in the primeval soup, say, billions of years ago, whatever little chemicals may have acquired the ability to begin to think they were going to replicate themselves, the energies coming in from the sun would break them to pieces. So just having heat coming into a system doesn't help the system in terms of increasing its organization. That's a necessary condition, all right, but it isn't sufficient, and the question is, what else do you have to have? Now, this is not something maybe you'll find in most thermodynamics textbooks, but if you will find it in every type of human experience or scientific experience that you know anything about. In order to have an increasingly organized, increasingly complex open system into which energy is flowing, you have to have an open system with available energy, of course, but that isn't enough. In addition to that, you have to have some kind of a program to direct the growth. This could be called a code or a template or a blueprint or a pattern. You can't just let it grow as a heterogeneous blob. It'll be that and nothing else if it grows at all. There must be some kind of an organizing system to direct its growth, like a blueprint. If all you had to have, you see, was open system and available energy, think how you could, what a wonderful world. You could build buildings that way. Just pile the bricks out on the site, that's an open system, and let the sun's energy come. There's plenty of energy to build a building, and the sun will organize the bricks into a building. Well, of course, that's absurd, and it doesn't matter how long you wait. In fact, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. As time goes on, the bricks don't become a building, the bricks become dust by the second law of thermodynamics. So you have to have a mechanism, a pattern or a program In the case of a living system now, for example, a seed which grows up into a tree, you do have the marvelous complex genetic code, a code that specifies how that's to grow and assures it's going to grow the same way its ancestors were. And the building has the blueprint and so forth, so that every kind of a system that we know anything about in which there is an increase of order, you have a directing program available to that system. But even that isn't all, and there must also be a conversion mechanism. You can't just have the raw energy come in. That breaks things up. You have to store the energy in some kind of a storage system, a membrane or something, and then convert it and give it out in the right way and time to do the very specific, precise, explicit work of building up the complex structure. In the case of the seed, you have the marvelous mechanism of photosynthesis. Every kind of a system that we know anything about in which there is an increase of order in an open system, you have a code and a mechanism. And if you don't have both, you don't get growth. Now, what about evolution? Of course, the evolutionary biosphere is the greatest growth system of all if it really happens. But what is the directing program that directs those primeval molecules how to organize themselves into living populations? Or simple populations like worms into complex populations like crocodiles? What's the directing program that tells them how to do that? Or what is the storage and conversion mechanism or motor that converts the raw energy from the sun into the specific work of building up the complex structure? And until evolutionists have an answer to that, they have no right to say that there's no problem with the second law of thermodynamics and evolution. Let me quote from Dr. Jeffrey Wicken, Theoretical Biology, April 1979. He says, evolutionary processes are anamorphic, or complexity generating. The passage of evolutionary time is accompanied by the emergence of structures having progressively greater morphological and functional complexity. But the essential feature of evolutionary anamorphosis remains enigmatic. It is not successfully derived from or identified with more fundamental physical chemical laws, particularly those of thermodynamics. Nor has it been adequately explained at its own phenomenological level by evolutionary theory. Neo-Darwinism in particular seems to have enormous difficulty in accounting for this fundamental feature of evolutionary process. No, this problem has not been solved. Dr. Charles Smith, in an article in Biosystems, says that this conflict between evolution and thermodynamics is one of the most fundamental unsolved problems in biology. And it can't be solved just by saying that the Earth is an open system. That's a vacuous statement, and that's not insulting. That's just a vacuous statement is one that conveys no information. And that has no information in it because every system is an open system, open to the energy of the sun to one degree or another. And so to say that doesn't say anything that isn't true of everything. And so we've got to say more than that in order to describe how evolution can function in spite of the second law of thermodynamics. Now maybe someday somebody's going to work this out. Some people are trying. Dr. Prigogine got a Nobel Prize several years ago for an attempt in this direction, or at least some people interpret it that way. He didn't say so. But nobody's solved it yet. It's still an unsolved problem. Maybe somebody will someday. But then you see, all that will have been accomplished is that somehow somebody will explain how the evolutionary model can still be valid in spite of the second law of thermodynamics. Still won't be as good as the creation model, because the creation model doesn't have to explain the second law of thermodynamics. The creation model predicts the second law of thermodynamics. It's exactly what we expect to see in the real world if creation is true. Well, I want to say just a few words, though, about past systems and processes. As far as the present world is concerned, it looks like evolution is not only observed, but isn't even possible, so far as we can tell, in terms of the basic laws of science. But maybe the laws were different in the past, and so let's look at the past. Sometimes people will tell us that the reason you don't see these real vertical changes from one kind to a higher, more complex kind is because that does take millions of years. Well, we presumably have the record of millions of years in the sedimentary rocks and the fossil beds and the crust of the earth. And here we have supposedly the documented history of life on the earth, over millions of years of earth history. And Dr. Dunbar, for example, of Yale, in his widely used historical geology book, says that although the comparative study of living plants and animals may give circumstantial evidence of evolution, fossils provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simple to more and more complex forms. And so the fossil record of the past, as represented in this so-called geological column, is the documented record of evolution. And this is a cross-section down through the Earth's crust, presumably, with the oldest rocks on the bottom, the youngest on the top, and the oldest rocks on the bottom have the marine invertebrates of the Cambrian period. Before that, maybe only one-cell organisms in the Precambrian, maybe a billion years or so ago. And then gradually the invertebrates evolve into fishes and vertebrates, and the fishes into amphibians, the amphibians into reptiles, into mammals, birds, finally man. And so we have in the geological column the fossil record of the actual evolution of life over the history of the world. And this is the record of the past. Now, what would the creationists expect to find in the fossils? We're aware of fossils. We have a number of people who like to go looking for fossils. Dr. Parker down here has a great collection of fossils, and we're very interested in fossils. But and so we know about fossils all right. In fact, some people call us fossils for that matter, but at any rate, the facts are there, but how do we interpret the facts? What would the creationists expect to find in the fossil record? Well, we would expect to find essentially the same kind of plants and animals that you find in the present world. Or you'd find some extinct forms, of course, because there is this downward principle in nature that leads things to decay and die and become extinct, perhaps. But you would not find any evidence of nascent forms leading to higher levels, any intermediate forms leading to higher levels. There would be horizontal changes. We'd expect to find new varieties, perhaps, and we would expect to find a great variety of plants and animals with the same classification system that we have in the present world. We could still classify them into species and genera and families and orders and so on, just as we can today. We wouldn't have any problem because same world, same types of organisms, same created kinds. But we would not expect to find any transitions from one kind into another any more than we do in the present world. And so creationists have been predicting for 150 years or more that no matter how many fossils you find, you're never going to find the transitional series that show how one of these basic kinds evolved into another. Charles Darwin, of course, back 150 years ago, he was aware of that problem and that need, and he said, just let us find more fossils and we will find these missing links. But they still haven't been found. The creation model has been proved correct so far, and the transitional forms are not yet found. As far as the oldest of all the Cambrian invertebrates are concerned, well, you may not be able to see that very well. That's from one of the museums, a Cambrian diorama. And if you could look at this more closely, you would see that it's basically the same kind of organisms that you find in the present waters off of Florida, off of San Diego. You find snails and brachiopods and sponges and jellyfish and starfish and so forth. Some extinct kinds like the trilobites. But you find really, and those are quite complex arthropods, but essentially you find the same types of, as a matter of fact, in the Cambrian period, all the great phyla, so-called, of the animal kingdom have now been found. They used to say that the vertebrates didn't come into existence until the Ordovician period, the next one up, but now fossil vertebrates, fishes that is, have been found in the Cambrian period too, so that all of the phyla of the animal kingdom have been found in the oldest of the geological ages. It's very much like the present world, except for extinction. Once again, though, all of these basic kinds are very complex and they appear suddenly without any intermediate forms leading up to them. And the same thing is true as you go on up. There's no transition from the invertebrate to the vertebrate. You used to think that maybe this fish, Chrysopterygian coelacanth fish, might have been beginning to be the fish that was going to become an amphibian until they found it a number of years ago still living after having been believed to be extinct for a long, long time, way back into the Paleozoic almost. But now it's still living, and so it wasn't the intermediate form after all. Some have said the lungfishes, but those are not intermediate forms. Let me just quote from an article on lungfishes by Errol White in the Proceedings of the Linnean Society of London. He says, the lungfishes, like all other fishes, have their origins firmly based in nothing. There are no intermediate forms leading up to the fishes. What about the amphibians? Well, here's what Dr. Lewis Carroll says, Biological Review of the Cambridge Philosophical Society. He says, unfortunately, not a single specimen of an appropriate reptilian ancestor is known prior to the appearance of two reptiles. I got ahead of the amphibians there. The amphibian into the reptile, I should say. But there's no intermediate link between the amphibian and the reptile. Some have suggested a creature known as ichthyostagid, but the chronology is wrong on that, and this author says there is no such ancestry. He says the absence of such ancestral forms leaves many problems of the amphibian-reptilian transition unanswered. Well, we going up through the reptiles supposedly evolved into mammals and birds and finally into man. As far as the mammals are concerned, George Gaylord Simpson, one of the greatest paleontologists of our day, has said that each of the 32, I believe, orders of mammals in the animal kingdom appears on the fossil record suddenly without any intermediates leading up to them. One example is the bat. And this was on the cover of Science magazine several years ago, and this is the oldest known bat. And what is it? It's 100% bat. You don't see the bat's wings beginning to evolve or any of the rest of the structure. It's a complete bat right from the start, and the same thing is true of the rodents and all the other mammals. Right from the start, they're complete. Some have said, well, within the mammals, though, there are transitional forms. What about the horses? Horse series is one of the classic examples of evolution. Let me quote from Dr. David Ropp, Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, curator of geology there. He says, instead of finding the gradual unfolding of life, what geologists of Darwin's time and geologists of the present day actually find is a highly uneven and jerky record. That is, species appear in the sequence very suddenly, show little or no change during their existence in the record, then abruptly go out of the record. And it isn't always clear, in fact it's rarely clear, that the descendants were any better adapted than their predecessors. In other words, biological improvement is hard to find. And then he goes on and talks about the horses. He says, the record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have now had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice simple progression when few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. And you find the different stages in the so-called evolutionary horse series all living together and overlapping each other and so on, so it's more like a bush than a tree, and there really isn't any evidence of evolution at all. Same thing is true of the elephants and the others. Well, we could go on. No, I think I better skip that one. Somebody might say that's a caricature, and I don't want to do that. But the point that I would like to make is that, as many evolutionists have acknowledged, that it isn't even possible to imagine fundamental intermediaries that would function adequately. And what I tried to show there was what some have said would be the way that whales were evolved. You know, whales are supposed to evolve from land mammals. And they say something like a cow or a buffalo or a pig somehow went back into the water and evolved into the whale and the dolphin. And so somebody tried to imagine what the intermediate forms were like, and that was the result. But it's pretty hard to imagine as to what it would be like. Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, who is probably the leading younger paleontologist today, in an article entitled "The Return of Hopeful Monsters," says this. He says, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Well, precious little indeed. It contains nothing in the way of intermediate forms. After 150 years of collecting literally billions of fossils, there is not one form in which there is a true intermediate structure. Understanding of the real world. Thank you very much.
We're expecting that you will cheer Dr. David E. Fisher with the same enthusiasm. Otherwise, one might get the impression that this was some kind of prize fight where the protagonists were not operating on equal levels. Let's stand up and stretch for just a moment before Dr. Fisher presents his response.
It is water. It is water.
Yeah, isn't that irritating? We will proceed immediately with Dr. Fisher's reply. Dr. Fisher.
Thank you very much. I haven't talked to an audience like this in a place of worship since my bar mitzvah. Let me start off by telling you who I am and why I'm here. This talk is not a reply. Dr. Morris and I prepared independent talks on these topics, and so please don't expect me to answer the questions that he's raised. I am not a biologist. I am not an evolutionist. I accept the theory of evolution, but I have never done any original scientific research in biology or evolution. I am not an expert witness. I am a chemist, a physicist. I've done research and I've written a few books for young people in the fields of chemistry, physics, geology, and astronomy. And I'm here today because the creationist point of view is not an attack only on the theory of evolution. It's an attack on all of science. And that's what I want to talk about today. You cannot accept creationism without throwing away everything we know about geology, chemistry, physics, astronomy. You cannot accept it without disinheriting ourselves and our heirs from all of science. Now, this may in fact be a consummation devoutly to be wished, but it is not justified by the observable facts. Let me start off by discussing what science is. Now, there are two ways to look at it. Let me first give you a definition by Albert Einstein. Einstein says, science is based on the universal operation of the law of cause and effect. It cannot for a moment entertain the idea of any kind of supernatural being who interferes in the course of events. By this definition, any idea of creation is not science. Now, it may be true, maybe that's the way things happened, but the study of such events does not fall within the realm of science. And I am concerned at the creationists' push to have creationism included in the public schools in the science curriculum. Einstein would say it cannot be science. Every scientist in the world would agree with Einstein. There's another way to look at science. That's from an operational point of view. Now, what do scientists do? We observe the universe. We put together a theory of what we think all the observed facts mean, and then we test the theory. The testability of the theory is a basic part of the scientific process. Evolution has been subjected to such tests for the past 100 years. It's still around. An awful lot of theories have been put forward in the past 100 years. They come out every month, and they're subjected to tests, and they fail, and they're discarded. Nobody was born being taught evolution as a matter of faith. We accept it because it consistently passes the tests. And we object to other theories and throw them away when they fail the tests. The creationists often attack evolution by saying it is only a theory, not a law. That it's not a scientific fact. And you hear, as you've heard tonight, the opinions of one evolutionist after another criticizing evolution, saying why it's no good, it fails here and it fails there. The effect is to say that it's being discarded, that there's a movement to throw it aside, and this is not true. It's an understandable kind of mistake, and I think it's perhaps our fault as scientists in communicating to the public what we do. The basic thing a scientist does is not to learn science, but to unlearn it, to doubt, to test everything, not to believe anything anybody tells you. but to test it, to devise new ways of testing it, to devise new ways of looking at the facts, put together a new theory, see if it fits better. There is not a biologist in the world worth his salt who doesn't dream of overthrowing a theory of evolution and putting something that he put together in its place. Every scientific journal that comes out, every single week, there's 1,000 of them. Every one of them is filled with articles saying that all the other articles are wrong. That's what science is all about. And so naturally, it's easy for someone to look through these and say, this man disagrees with evolution in this manner, this man disagrees with another. This man says evolution is based on one thing, this man says you can't base anything on that. That's the way science works, that's what it's all about. But through it all, through the past 100 years of this fighting, this continual inspection of the theory, it's still here. The details of it are argued continually and will continue to be argued for a long time. Whether it operates by natural selection or by some other means, I don't know. But it is very clear that evolution as such exists. The immensity of life forms that we see today have evolved in some way from simpler organisms. We don't see it happening today. We don't see one species change to another. On the other hand, we do see some changes. The gonococcus, the germ that causes gonorrhea, is changing, is evolving, it's becoming resistant to penicillin. I'm sure you don't spend too much time thinking about it, but I have some friends that worry about that a lot. In order for this gonococcus to evolve into something completely different, a different species, we do need much more time than we have. And this is a basic principle of evolution and one that has been often attacked. We must have immense periods of time for observable evolution to take place. If the Earth, if the universe is only a few thousand years old, evolution does not work. That in itself is a critical test of evolution. And you've often heard that evolution is not testable. There's one perfect test. If you can show that the universe is 10,000 years old, evolution is finished. This is what I mean when I say an attack on evolution is an attack on all these other sciences. You must show that all our other sciences are wrong if you're going to show that creationism is right. Let me give a few examples of some of the things we do know about science. If you strike a match and watch it burn, we understand what is happening. If you look carefully, you'll see at the bottom of every flame there's a little drop of water. The Greeks used to think the universe was put together out of earth, air, fire, and water, and that fire and water were opposites. Well, then how can water come out of a fire? Their ideas were wrong. We've shown them to be wrong by scientific attack, by making measurements, by putting together new theories. We understand now what happens when a match burns. We understand it from atomic theory. Now, no one has ever seen an atom. There is no direct proof that atoms exist. But we have a theory of atoms. And this theory enables us to understand what elements we have to put together to create a match. When we strike the match and cause a fire, we're combining different elements with oxygen. We understand how they combine by another theory, the quantum theory. Now, there's lots wrong with the quantum theory. We could find plenty of quotes from Einstein saying that the quantum theory is a bunch of nonsense. People have been arguing about it. People will continue to argue about it. In its details, I'm sure it's wrong. In some details, I'm sure it's wrong. But overall, it's certainly correct. It allows us to understand that the hydrogen in the match is combining with oxygen, and that hydrogen and oxygen form an H2O molecule, and that's water, and that's why you see water in the presence of any fire. These theories, the atomic theory, the quantum theory, enable us to understand the universe. As another example, think of airplanes. They fly. They don't fall down. Well, sometimes they fall down. But mostly they fly. Now, how do they fly? We understand how they fly. We can make airplanes because we understand the kinetic theory of gases. It's still just a theory. I've got a couple of bars of iron here. If I try to push these two ends together, I can't do it. There's no way I have enough strength to make them fit. There's an invisible force keeping them apart. If I put the other end, wham. The fact that the opposite ends of the magnet attract and the like ends repel each other is a law of magnetism. It's a simple scientific law. The theory that describes it, the electromagnetic theory, is extremely complicated. I couldn't possibly explain it. And yet through it we understand how such things work. Evolution is a theory. It's not a scientific law. But it's a theory as firmly based as all these other theories. There are 5 basic theoretical cornerstones to all the science we have. The atomic theory, the quantum theory, the theory of relativity, the theory of plate tectonics, and the theory of evolution. Of them all, atomic theory is probably the best based, and then evolutionary theory. Its evolutionary theory is certainly as well based as the others. It doesn't make sense to speak of it as only a theory with the implication that a law is something we know, and a theory is a law that has not yet been proven. That's not what a theory is. A theory is a comprehensive gathering together of laws, of observations, and of ideas into an organic whole, a point of view which enables us to look out on the universe and make some sense out of it. And that's what science is all about. As an example, let's think about gravity for a moment. You know Newton's law of gravity. It says things fall down. If I drop this, you all know which way it's going to fall. It's not going up that way, it's going down. Always. Very simple statement of the law of gravity. Of course, it's not really all that simple, is it? Because as we said before, airplanes do go up. But there are other complications there. You've got an engine producing energy and that drives it up. In general, if you hold something out and drop it, it's going to fall down. That's Newton's law of gravity. Einstein put together a theory of gravity. His theory of relativity is actually 2 theories. The simple theory and the general theory of relativity. The general theory is in fact a theory of gravity. It's much more complex than Newton's law of gravity. But Newton's law of gravity is only a statement of what we see, that bodies attract each other. The earth attracts the matchbox and it falls. It doesn't tell us why things attract each other. Einstein's theory attempts to do that. It says that the universe we live in is composed of an entity called space-time, and space-time is curved by the presence of material objects, and the things moving in a curved space-time move in such a manner that we see them as attracting each other. Einstein's theory of gravity is much more complicated than Newton's simple law. And it's only a theory, not a law. But it's more accurate than Newton's law. It's more comprehensive than Newton's law. It's closer to the truth. When experiments were devised to differentiate between action based on Newton's law and action based on Einstein's theory wins. It predicts events that Newton does not predict. It accounts for measured distances more accurately. It's more accurate, more comprehensive. It's a closer approximation to universal truth than is Newton's law. And yet it's only a theory. So please don't go away thinking that evolution is only a theory. It is indeed a theory, a very beautiful, well-tested theory. In order to accept creationism, the creationists attack not only the theory of evolution, but many of these other aspects of physical science. And these are the points I want to talk about, because as I said, I am a physical scientist, not a biologist. One of the points that is often mentioned, that was in fact mentioned tonight, is entropy. It's a very complex subject. And to argue it scientifically would be a complex mathematical exercise. I'll try to talk about some examples to show that, in fact, evolution has no conflict with the concepts of entropy or anything in thermodynamics. To visualize how entropy works, think of a puzzle put together on this table. If I knock the puzzle off the table and it falls to the floor into bits, it's going to scatter. If I take a box in which the puzzle has not been placed and simply turn it upside down and let it fall onto the table, what is the chance that the pieces of the puzzle will happen to fall in just such a way that each piece is right next to its corresponding piece and the puzzle will fall together purely by accident? Not going to happen. It's not going to happen because of the second law of thermodynamics. A system cannot organize itself. But it is possible for me to put the puzzle together. Now, the creationists say you're falling into our trap. In order for the puzzle to be put together, some conscious human being must do it. An act of will must be performed. That's not so. And to give you an example, it's not so. What is needed is an input of energy into the system. And to give you an example of some perfectly ordinary systems that seem to organize themselves but really aren't, and are exactly analogous to the formation of life through an evolutionary, non-creationist, non-interventionist type of event. Consider a bowl of water, and you pour some salt into the water and stir it around and dissolve it. What happens is a totally disordered system. The individual atoms of the salt are completely dispersed throughout the solution. You have no idea where any of them are, and they're not even at any one place because they're in continual thermal motion. That's a completely disordered system. Now, if you take that bowl of salt water and place it in the sun and let it sit there for a while, the water is going to evaporate, and what you're going to be left with is a coating of salt crystals. The crystals are a perfectly organized system. Each atom fits exactly where it's supposed to fit, and it stays there, it doesn't move. You have a system here of a totally disorganized kind, exposed to sunlight, forming a perfectly well-organized system. Could I show a couple of slides of some of the results of this sort of process? Do I have a...
There's no pointer.
Okay, it doesn't matter. What I have here are simply a bunch of crystals that formed in analogous processes. These are in igneous processes rather than evaporation, but the same sort of thing. These form spontaneously by themselves and perfect geometrical shapes. Could you change that for me? I don't know if you can see it that clearly with the light on, but this is a beautiful organization of crystals. At one time, they were molten, completely without shape, completely without order. All you have to do is get rid of the extraneous matrix and let them cool down, and this is what you get. It is not a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. If we think of the living cells on Earth and how they form, how we take in elements from the environment and order them into our body, we are not violating any laws of thermodynamics because we are getting in energy from the sun. If you look at the system as a whole, at some moment there is an energy envelope, an energy content in the outer part of the sun. That energy leaves the sun and radiates out into space. As it expands, we know less and less about its position. The state of disorder of the system is increasing tremendously. A very small portion of that energy hits the Earth, and it helps us organize ourselves into our bodies. We take in carbon, oxygen from the air, and we become more ordered. But the total system, including the sun, becomes much, much more disordered. Entropy is increasing. Let me point out that the second law of thermodynamics, like all scientific laws, is a statement of observable facts. The people who made the observations, who formulated the second law of thermodynamics, knew that life existed. They knew that they were alive. If they thought that the living process violates this concept of the increase of entropy, it never would have been promulgated. I'd like to read you just a short statement from this book, Entropy for Biologists, by Harold Morrowitz, a professor at Yale University. Obviously, this idea that entropy violates biology, violates evolution, is not something new that the evolutionists hadn't thought of before. There's a whole bloody book here full of equations about it. The very ordered state of a biological system would, if left to itself, decay to the most disordered possible state. That's the second law. For this reason, work must constantly be performed to order the system. The continuous performance of this work requires a hot source and cold sink, which are ordinarily provided on the Earth's surface by the heat of the sun and the cold of outer space. If life were to evolve far away from any energy source, from any sun, that would be a violation, perhaps. But evolution as we see it on Earth is no violation whatsoever. I'm not sure when I started.
You started at 8:31.
Okay, so we're doing fine. Yep. Let me discuss next the concept of the age of the Earth and of the universe. This is a critical test of evolution. It's a test of creationism only in the sense that a literal interpretation of the Bible says that the Earth, well, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz v'kol tzva'am. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth and all the host of them. So if you interpret that literally, you say heaven, earth, everything was created at one time. And then if you add up all the ages since, you come to ages on the order of 6,000, 10,000, maybe 20,000 years. More importantly, the age is a test of evolutionary theory. Because if the age is really only a few thousands of years, then evolution doesn't have a chance. We are able to measure the age of the universe, of the galaxy, of stars, of meteorites, of the moon, of the earth, by many different methods involving chemistry, physics, geology. And in all of these, we get a very consistent picture. By measuring the galactic expansion, we can say that the universe was created roughly 15 billion years ago. It's a very inaccurate number. It may have been 10 billion, it may have been 30 or 40 billion. We don't know. But it had to be at least 10 billion years. And the important point is it's not a few thousand years. It's not a few million years. It's at least 10 billion years. From various measurements, and radioactivity is probably the prime one, we know that the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years. We know that much more accurately than we know the age of the universe. It's not 4 billion, it's not 5 billion, it's just about 4.5 billion years. The universe is at least 10 billion years old. They were not created at the same time. The radioactive dating of the Earth has been subject to a lot of creationist argument because they do realize how important it is. Let me see if I can find something. Yes, this is a book called Evolution, Possible or Impossible by James F. Coppedge. I was glancing through it and this one argument caught my eye because I was involved in it. He says, an article in a 1968 issue of the Journal of Geophysical Research admitted tremendous errors in the dating of rocks by the potassium-argon method. Scientists carefully dated samples of volcanic materials which had been erupted in the year 1800 on Hawaii. The dating was done in 1968. Therefore, the dating should have said that the rocks were 168 years old. 8 tests listed in the article, however, gave ages ranging from 160 million to almost 3 billion years. And this is described here as proof of the previous statement that there are no reliable radiometric time clocks. Now, as I say, this caught my eye because I was involved in this work. The article he quotes is by John Funkhauser, who is a colleague of mine, and who did this work following up some work we did together 2 years previously on the potassium-argon method. We had shown there that the potassium-argon method does not work for certain minerals, but instead gives a way of recognizing that these minerals trap gases from inside the Earth and therefore open up a whole new line of research. Funkhauser, in the work quoted here, was looking at some different classes of minerals to see if he could find some other minerals from islands, which we had not been able to find, which would also show this extra argon and therefore indicate to us that the rocks are not suitable for dating, but are suitable for this other line of research that we've been trying to establish. The article made it absolutely clear that the ages he was quoting were not to be considered ages, but were to be considered evidence that these particular minerals are not suitable for dating. The idea sometimes gets around, because potassium-argon is such a nice, simple method, that all you have to do is pick anything up and measure the potassium and the argon and you get an age for it. This is absolutely not true. I've spent the past 20 years arguing with people on what minerals are good for dating and what are not. As far as the age argument goes, the point is that whenever we find minerals that satisfy our scientific criteria as to whether or not they're suitable for age measurements, then using these we get ages for the Earth of billions of years. Meteorites, the moon, everything in the solar system, 4.5 billion years old. But it doesn't mean that any single rock we pick up gives a valid age. It certainly does not. I thought perhaps John had written a bad article and that the author of this book was simply guilty of ignorance. But when I go back to the article, I find that he clearly states that these are not valid ages and should not be considered as such. It wasn't ignorance, it was absolute wickedness. For an example of ignorance, I'll give you the next paragraph. He quotes Robert Whitelaw, nuclear consultant and professor of mechanical engineering, that cosmic rays may have accounted altogether for the buildup of argon-36, and therefore the potassium-argon method is of no use. The potassium-argon method does not use argon-36. It uses a different isotope entirely, argon-40. In fact, if the argon-36 that we see is due to cosmic rays, then that would make the observed ages even older, not younger, because you make a correction to argon-40, which is inversely proportional to the argon-36. In fact, we have done experiments to find out how much argon-36 is cosmic ray produced, and it's not very much at all. Another way of measuring the age of things is to look at the light coming from stars. We know that light moves at the velocity of light, 186,000 miles a second. If we see a star that is, for example, 5 billion light years away from us, we know that the light took 5 billion light years to get here, and that therefore the star is 5 billion years old. In fact, we don't know if the star exists today. We know that when we see it, when we look at it, we're seeing it as it was 5 billion years ago. The creationists naturally have to attack this. And here is an article in the book, Why Not Creation, which starts off by calculating the energy involved in light according to E equals mc squared, Einstein's equation that came out of relativity. And he goes through a complicated description about 9 times 10 to the 20th ergs of energy becoming a gram of mass, and a joule is 10 to the 7th ergs of energy, so you have a certain number of joules, and you divide by 3,600 seconds, and Niagara Falls generates 450,000 kilowatts. He goes through a very long description about the energy in starlight as compared to Niagara Falls, based on E equals mc squared, the Einsteinian equation, which comes from relativity. And he comes to the conclusion that it should be emphasized that however vast the universe may be, light photons from the most distant stars would be immediately visible, since the stars were made by conversion of light into closed orbits of energy we call mass. It's an argument based on Einstein's theory of relativity. It's a very scientific argument. It's absolute nonsense. Because Einstein's theory of relativity is based on the assumption that nothing can happen instantaneously, that no information can be transmitted at a velocity greater than the velocity of light. This is the great foundation point of Einstein's theory of relativity. It's a measure of his genius in that this assumption is not immediately apparent to anybody. It wasn't at the time. It still isn't. It was apparent to Einstein, And from this, he was able to build up a theory of relativity, which was then proven to be correct. Now, you may want to simply discard the theory of relativity, but you can't discard it and keep it at the same time. You can't use E equals mc squared to calculate how energy is converted into mass and say that's how stars are created, and then say that the light from the stars would be immediately visible throughout the universe. The light from the stars travels at the velocity of light. Nothing can travel faster. Light cannot be immediately visible throughout the universe if we are to keep the theory of relativity. This is what I mean when I say trying to take away the time span that evolution needs involves attacking everything we know about all the sciences. You've got to throw away quantum theory, which describes how radioactive atoms disintegrate. You've got to throw away the theory of relativity. You have to throw away geology and plate tectonics, because we can describe the motion of plates and the opening, for example, of the Atlantic Ocean, and it took 180 million years for the Atlantic Ocean to open. Now, maybe plate tectonics is wrong. Maybe the theory of evolution is wrong. Maybe the theory of relativity is wrong. Maybe quantum theory is wrong. Maybe the atomic theory is wrong. Maybe the kinetic theory of gases is wrong. They've all got to be wrong before you can throw away evolution. Since each of these theories is based on many experiments, there's not much probability that they're wrong. It's possible, but it's not very probable. Let's say the plate tectonic theory has a 1% chance of being wrong. Quantum theory is based a lot better than that on a lot more experiments. So maybe it's only got a 1 chance in 1,000 of being wrong. For them both to be wrong, you run into a problem that probabilities do not add, they multiply. So for them both to be wrong, the probability becomes 1 in 100,000. And now, is relativity also wrong? What's the chance of that? 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000,000? You've got to multiply that together, and you end up with things like 1 chance in, the number is so large it becomes meaningless, that all our science is wrong. And it's all got to be wrong for the Earth to be only a few thousand years old. There's another argument on the age of the Earth, which says that if, it's a clever attempt, it tries to turn our radioactivity arguments back on ourselves. If we measure the decay of potassium into argon and say that measures the age of the Earth, well, we know that also uranium decays into helium. And if uranium has been decaying into helium for 4 billion years on this Earth, the atmosphere should be full of helium, and it isn't. There's less than 1 part per million of helium in the Earth's atmosphere. But we know this. We've known it for a long time. No scientist would seriously put forward potassium-argon dating as a valid form of measurement if there was this problem with the uranium-helium system. There isn't. Helium is a light gas. The temperature of our atmosphere gives it thermal energy, and because it's so light, the amount of thermal energy it gets is sufficient to throw it out into space. I've done some calculations, other people have done calculations, and it's clear that helium will last about 1 million years in the Earth's atmosphere. So the helium produced 1 billion years ago is gone. It left within 1 million years of its production. There's absolutely no problem about it at all. In fact, the research I've been working on for the past 10 years is on a closely related problem, and that is how the argon got into the atmosphere. Argon is too heavy to be lost. And it is produced, argon-40, from the decay of potassium. And we know how much potassium is in the earth, and we know how much argon is in the atmosphere, and we can calculate how long it took for that argon to build up. And there are arguments about how the earth degasses, how the argon is lost from the rocks into the atmosphere. And I've been arguing for years with a half dozen colleagues in Minnesota and in Japan and in Australia. And I haven't yet convinced them, and they haven't yet convinced me. And every day we do more work and more experiments. But roughly, it's taken a few billion years. The big argument is whether it took all of the 4.5 billion years, or whether it's been coming out only more recently. Whether it's come out through all of our time, or only through part of our time. But there's no way you can get the argon that we're breathing in and out this moment in less than a few billion years. Absolutely no way at all. Well, I think I'll just simply stop at this point. Let me go over my conclusions very briefly. I hope I've shown that by any standard definition of science, creationism is not science. The creationism is put forward by people who are not scientists. I think this is an important part of the argument, I have to say. In order to do that, let me define what a scientist is. Let me do it by analogy with a poet. A poet is a man who writes poetry. A man who studies English literature and gets a PhD in English literature and has read every poem ever written is not by that fact a poet. A poet writes poetry. A scientist does science. Science is scientific research. A man who gets a PhD in science and goes out and teaches is not a scientist. A scientist is a man who does scientific research. Most of us also teach. In any decent university, you'll be taught science by a man who spends at least half his time doing research. But a man who doesn't do scientific research is not a scientist. And among the creationists, there are very few people who do scientific research. There may be people with earned doctorates, although when you investigate them, they are more often doctorates in theology or engineering than in science. But a doctorate in science is not the criterion of a scientist. It's not even necessary. Tommy Gold, one of our greatest astronomers, does not have a PhD, but boy, he does research. And the people that do research in science accept the theory of evolution, at least in its broad terms, as I stated earlier, that in some manner, the living complexity we see before us has evolved from simpler forms. The attacks on evolution include, of necessity, although often disguised, attacks on everything else in science. And if you seriously want to get rid of evolution, you must get rid of the theory of relativity, the quantum theory. You must throw away everything we know about astronomy and geology. Even atomic theory, kinetic theory, everything has to come into doubt because they're all involved. We are not here involved in a scientific argument between two different forms of science as to which one should be taught. That is not the point. The point is whether a science teacher should be forced to teach something which fails the criteria of science put forward by other scientists. If you can find a biology teacher who believes in creationism and wants to teach that, I say fine, I have no argument with that. Let any science teacher teach what he thinks is good science. But if you want to make a law that every biology teacher must teach creationism alongside the other. You're saying he must teach something he doesn't believe in, because you are not going to find very many good biology teachers that will accept creationism. And if you start telling people they must teach what they don't believe in, we're going to a very different form of government, one that I don't care to live under. Finally, let me point out, as I mentioned before, that evolution is not a dogma protected by a monolithic scientific establishment. There is no monolithic scientific establishment. The scientific establishment, by its very nature, consists of a bunch of individuals all trying to prove that the other guy is wrong. That's the strength of science. You can't come out with any cockamamie statement and make people believe it. You've got to prove it. You've got to shove it down their throats with one experiment after another. And there isn't a biologist alive who wouldn't take the Nobel Prize by overthrowing the theory of evolution. And they've tried. And they find things wrong with it. They find things they disagree with it today. They'll find other things tomorrow to disagree with. The fight will go on continually. That's what's so good about it. It is a fight. It's not everybody sitting there and saying, "This I believe." It's absolutely not that at all. That's the point of view imposed on science by people who are not scientists. And I think since this is my first and only chance in my life to win the Nobel Prize, I'll stop now.
We thank both of our speakers for their dignified and helpful presentations. Let's stand up and stretch once more. This will be a much shorter stretch than the last one. You should stretch only one arm this time rather than two.